A head in a bucket in the basement of the house he grew up in. The person who found it was his mother. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This is the morning of February 23rd, 2022, at an ordinary house on Stony Brook Lane on the west side of Green Bay, Wisconsin. The woman behind it all wasn't a stranger who broke in during the night. Police would spend more than 6 hours questioning her. She was the victim's close friend, going back to high school. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to walk through the entire Taylor Schabusiness case, from Shad Therian's last night to a trial where the jury needed less than an hour to reach a verdict. This isn't a story about a stranger hiding in the dark. This is a story about a real friendship, a real addiction, and a line no one, not even the people closest to it, would ever thought would be crossed. Imagine sitting in that exact room that night with a friend you'd known since you were 13, 14 years old. Nothing in your shared history warns you about what's coming. That's what makes this case so haunting, not because it's random, but because of how fragile it shows the trust we place in people we think we already know. This case would later be mentioned in the same breath as some of the most shocking scenes in Wisconsin's recent history. But behind every sensational headline sits a question we're going to spend this whole video trying to answer. What actually happened inside one person's mind that turned an ordinary evening between two old friends into one of the most talked about violent cases this state has seen in years? There's no mystery about who did it. That part was never really in question. The mystery that kept investigators, psychiatrists, and an entire courtroom arguing for months was what was actually happening inside her mind when she did it, and whether mind is even the right word for what was left of it that night. This is the story of Taylor Schabusiness and Shad Therian. Before his name showed up in every news broadcast in the country, Shad Therian was just a 24-year-old guy living in Green Bay, the city where he was born and raised, the city where his mother still lives, in the very house he once called home. People who knew him describe him with one word. His father used it again and again when he later took the stand. Polite. Not the kind of adjective people reach for to dress up a victim after the fact. It's the kind of word that comes out naturally, the kind a family member gives you when caught off guard, with no time to prepare something poetic. Friends who grew up with him mentioned the small things, that he'd show up when a friend needed a ride, that he remembered birthdays most people forget. None of it makes headlines. All of it makes a person. He had a habit a lot of us share. Almost no one ever thought it could turn dangerous. He never really let go of people who'd once been close to him. Now, Taylor Schabusiness was not a new name in Shad's life. They'd been friends since middle school, then high school. The kind of friendship that stretches across years, across different chapters of life. The kind where it's been a while text actually means something, not just small talk. People close to Shad says he was the type to let an old friend back into his life. No heavy interrogation, no demand for an explanation for the years apart. That's a good quality to have. It's also the small detail we want you to hold on to right now, because it comes back at the end of this video in a completely different light. No one in the neighborhood imagined that inviting an old friend over could be the last night of someone's life. No one imagined that the very trust, the very generosity in Shad, the thing that made his father call him polite, could be the door that opened onto the worst tragedy of his life. In later interviews with local press, neighbors described the Therian family as quiet, the kind of family you could live next to for decades with nothing to report. No shouting, no police visits, no rumors. It's the kind of street where something like this isn't supposed to happen, which of course is exactly the point. It happened anyway. Shad's mother worked. kept the house, and lived with her son like millions of other families across America. And that's exactly what makes what happened next so hard to accept. This tragedy didn't come from a bad part of town. It didn't come from a broken home. It arrived in the middle of a completely ordinary life, inside the very house where Shad grew up safe. Now that's worth sitting with for a moment, because most true crime stories give you somewhere to point. A dangerous neighborhood, a history of violence, a red flag someone should have caught. This one doesn't offer that comfort. It offers a quiet street, a normal house, and a young man who did everything people tell you to do. Stay close to family, keep your old friends, don't shut people out, and it still wasn't enough to save him. By 2022, Taylor Schabusiness, then 24, was no longer the harmless classmate from their high school years. According to her own family's testimony at sentencing, Taylor had once had what they called a promising life ahead of her, before she was introduced to methamphetamine by her own husband. This is a small detail, nearly invisible to the people around her until it was already too late. The addiction didn't come from some stranger on the street. It came from the person she once vowed to spend her life with. Family members who testified painted a picture of someone unrecognizable from the young woman they remembered. Someone who, years earlier, had held down jobs, maintained relationships, and showed no signs of the person she'd eventually become. Many criminology experts, looking back at cases like this one, point to something very easy to overlook. Before a person becomes the one who causes harm, very often, they were the ones harmed first. Not as an excuse for what came later, that's never acceptable, but to understand the context a person slid through to get there. Think about how that works in practice. A partner who's supposed to be your safest person slowly becomes the one who introduces you to the thing that eventually destroys your judgment. It doesn't happen in a single conversation. It happens in small doses, over months, until the version of you that existed before starts to feel like a different person entirely. In hindsight, it's obvious. At the time, no one was looking in hindsight. To Shad, Taylor was still the old friend he'd always known. There was no history of violence between them, no restraining order, no record of abuse. The only thing that had truly changed was a chemical, quietly rewiring how Taylor's brain responded to the world around her. And she hid it well enough that Shad's father, who'd met her many times, still remembered her by that one word: polite. On the night of February 22nd, 2022, two old friends met at Shad's mother's house and used methamphetamine together in the basement. An evening that began completely ordinarily between two people who'd known each other their entire lives almost. There's one small, almost invisible detail here. On the night of February 22nd, 2022, two old friends met at Shad's mother's house and used methamphetamine together in the basement. An evening that began completely ordinarily between two people who'd known each other nearly their whole lives. However, there's one small, almost invisible detail here. Until it was already too late, no one in that house, not even Taylor herself, knew exactly how much she'd used, or how far her brain had already been pushed in the hours before. This is exactly what makes the Schabusiness case different from most true crime stories you've heard. There was no predator planning for months, no grooming process, no threatening messages saved from before. If you look at the entire history of contact between these two people before that night, there's nothing police or anyone else could point to and say, this was the warning sign. The danger in this story doesn't live in a stranger carrying bad intentions. It lives in a quiet, prolonged process inside a brain being slowly rewritten by a chemical. A process even the person living through it didn't fully understand was happening. And that's the part that should unsettle you more than any stranger ever could. A stranger you can watch for. A stranger gives you something to be afraid of and something to avoid. What happened to Shad didn't come with any of that. It came wearing a face he'd known for over a decade. Before we go any further, let's pause for a second. There was an important psychological mechanism at work inside Taylor at that point. It explains a lot of what happens later. Forensic psychiatry has a name for it: substance-induced psychosis. Imagine your brain as a filtering system. It helps tell you what's real, who's a friend, who's a threat. Sustained methamphetamine use at high doses can break that filter. It causes hallucinations, delusions, a serious break from reality. It's not rare either. Emergency rooms across the country see cases of meth-induced psychosis regularly. People who, for a period of hours or days, are functioning in a reality that doesn't match the one everyone else around them is living in. And this is where that line starts to blur. But one detail makes this case more complicated than a simple drug episode. Prosecutors later pointed out that Taylor had a pre-existing fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer, Wisconsin's most notorious serial killer. She had a photo of him on her phone. She'd reportedly said she'd found him attractive. Many criminologist experts call this hybristophilia, an attraction to people who commit violent crimes. Experts still debate it. Is this an independent factor or just one piece of a much larger picture? And here's the real question. Where's the line between a brain being unmade by chemicals and a conscious choice? There's one more thing worth mentioning, something experts only ever raised carefully throughout the case. It's called learned helplessness. This is a state that develops when someone, after a long time inside a controlling relationship, slowly loses the belief that they can change their own circumstances. Imagine being pushed deeper and deeper into an addiction by the one person you trust the most. Not once, over and over, until saying no stops feeling like a choice your brain can actually reach for. To be clear, this isn't an excuse. The jury, as we'll see later, ultimately didn't accept it as grounds to waive criminal responsibility. But it helps us see this case as more than just a single burst of violence, as the peak of a long chain of layered harm. No one around Taylor, including her own family, realized these forces were compounding each other, right before the night that changed everything. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire case. Not a single villain with a single motive. A collision of chemistry, of history, of a mind that may have already been reshaped long before that night in the basement. That night, no one was keeping an eye on Chad. No one knew he was down in the basement. There was no security camera in that room, just the two of them. A stimulant moving throughout both of their bloodstreams, in a widening gap between the person Shad thought he was sitting with and the person actually there in that moment. Shad's mother was elsewhere in the house. Ordinary. No reason to worry. No one, not even Shad, realized they were standing at the edge. Police would later reconstruct that night. Violence broke out in the basement. No witnesses. No alarm raised from that room. No screaming heard from anywhere else in the house. No emergency call made that night. Just the silence of a house. In a morning coming that would never be like any morning before it. It's the kind of detail that makes this case so difficult to sit with. Not the violence itself. True crime audiences have heard plenty of violence. It's the ordinariness surrounding it. The mundane hum of a furnace. A mother sleeping one floor up. A house that from the outside looked exactly like every other house on the street on that exact night. This is the hardest part of the whole story to tell. It's also the part we'll tell with the most restraint, exactly as promised at the start of this video. The night of February 22nd, 2022. The house on Stony Brook Lane, west side of Green Bay. Upstairs, an ordinary evening for an ordinary family. The living room light might still be on. There might be a TV murmuring somewhere. Downstairs, two old friends, in an evening slowly slipping off its rails. Picture that room around midnight. Dim yellow light, the washing machine, or maybe the furnace humming somewhere nearby. The kind of background noise no one notices in an ordinary American house until they're forced to remember it later. Upstairs, Shad's mother might have been watching TV or already asleep, with absolutely no idea what the space just a few feet beneath her was holding. Two old friends, a basement, a drug quietly rewriting the way one of them saw the other. And then something happened in that room that meant Shad Therion, 24, would never walk out of it alive. We won't describe in detail what happened to his body, but one fact needs to be said because it sits at the center of everything that follows. This wasn't a death that happened and ended in an instant. It stretched across hours, in a sequence of actions prosecutors would later describe as going far beyond a single burst of rage. Hours, not seconds, not the flash of temper true crime stories usually center on. Hours in a quiet basement, under a house where a mother slept one floor above. If Shad's life has a before and after line, it falls exactly on this night. No exact timestamps for what happened in that room were ever made public. The court record only confirms it went on for a long time, and it ended before dawn. The one thing we know for certain is what happened the next morning, the morning of February 23rd. The house was as quiet as any other morning. Nothing warned her. Shad's mother woke up. Maybe she made a cup of coffee. Maybe she was thinking about the ordinary things she had to do that day. An appointment, an errand, a call she needed to make. Somewhere in the house, it registered. She hadn't heard a sound from the basement in a while. No footsteps, no music, no voices, just quiet. In a part of the house that was never usually this quiet for this long. She walked towards the stairs. One step, then another, the basement door, her hand on the handle, and then a pause. Maybe only for a few seconds, but the kind of seconds she'd never fully be able to put into words during the trial that followed. The house behind her, still completely silent. No sound climbing up from below. She opened the door. She went down, one step at a time. And at the bottom of the stairs, she saw something no mother is ever prepared to see. There was no scream, not right away. Nothing as dramatic as people tend to imagine. Just a frozen kind of silence. The moment when the body goes still, when the mind still hasn't caught up yet with what the eyes took in. Her hands were shaking. The phone in her hands was shaking. She turned, walked out of the basement. She called 911. When Green Bay police arrived, they found Taylor Schabusiness. On her hands, the mark of a dark-colored substance. Something a detective would later testify to noticing within the first few minutes of contact. There was no particular commotion when officers stepped into the house. No chaos. No one running. According to the case record, Taylor appeared strangely calm. This is something the sentencing judge would later single out. When he reviewed her interview with police shortly after the incident, she was lucid and understood what was going on. In his words, spoken in court months later, everything was there. No panic, no disorientation, nothing that looked like someone who just lived through or just caused the worst thing of their life. Police began an interview that stretched past 6 hours, spread across multiple breaks over 2 days, February 23rd and February 28th. Throughout all of it, Taylor never showed the panic or disorientation you might expect from someone genuinely in the grip of an acute psychotic break. She was arrested that same day, February 23rd, 2022, less than 24 hours after an evening that started as completely ordinary reunion between two old friends. And for the Therion family, the moment everything changed forever wasn't a loud explosion. not a dramatic chase like in the movies. It was a staircase down to a basement. A silence that only lasted a few seconds, but long enough to split a mother's life into two halves, before and after. In a 911 call no mother ever expects to have to make in the very house where she raised her son. The initial story, if you can even call it that, seemed clear enough from the start. Police had a suspect at the scene, there was physical evidence, there was a partial admission during the long interview. But one detail didn't add up. Not about where she did it. That was barely in dispute from the beginning. About why, and whether she should bear full criminal responsibility for what she'd done. A few months after her arrest, Taylor Schabusiness's legal team filed a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. Wisconsin's version of the insanity defense. This is a turning point that transformed what looked like a straightforward case into a complicated legal fight. If the jury accepted that Taylor was psychotic enough at the time to be unable to tell right from wrong, she could avoid a standard prison sentence and instead be committed to psychiatric treatment. It's a defense that succeeds in only small fractions of cases where it's raised, and for good reason. Juries are understandably wary of it, but its rarity is exactly what made this case worth watching. If any circumstances were going to test that threshold, heavy methamphetamine use combined with a documented history of fixation on violence looked, on paper, like a genuine test case. The first story made perfect sense. A young woman, deep in a meth binge, completely losing control in one moment, until someone looked closer at her own behavior right afterward. The notable calm, the lucidity throughout the long interrogation, and a pre-existing fascination with violence that a single random drug episode couldn't fully explain. The prosecutor of the case made a point that later became central to the entire trial. If this really was just a result of a drug-induced psychosis, you'd expect to see panic, disorientation, or at least some kind of chaotic behavior right after. Instead, what security footage and police testimony captured was a startlingly organized sequence of behavior, the kind that made even seasoned investigators question the line between illness and intent. It's worth pausing on how rare the combination actually is. Most cases involving a genuine psychotic break come with some visible unraveling afterward. Confusion, incoherence, a person who can't quite explain what just happened. Sometimes because part of them genuinely doesn't remember. What investigators described instead was something closer to composure. And composure in a case like this becomes its own kind of evidence. While the public followed the case through a simple lens, was she evil or was she insane? Wisconsin's legal system was running a far more complicated process, a bifurcated trial. Phase 1, determine whether Taylor actually committed the acts. Phase 2, which only happens if Phase 1 ends in a guilty verdict, determines whether she qualifies for a mental health exemption from criminal responsibility. Now, most viewers never see this structure explained because most cases never reach it. It exists specifically for situations this murky, where guilt isn't really in question, but the defendant's state of mind absolutely is. In Phase 1, the evidence leaned overwhelmingly one way: the blood on her hands, the forensic evidence at the scene, and maybe the most striking of the entire trial, prosecutors presented evidence that before the incident, Taylor had searched on her phone for information about Jeffrey Dahmer. Forensics doesn't lie, and it was saying something very different from the picture of someone completely out of control, with no awareness of anything around them. The jury took less than an hour to find Taylor guilty on all 3 counts in Phase 1. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. But the story wasn't over. Phase 2, the insanity defense, still lay ahead. Now here, both sides presented almost entirely opposing evidence. The defense emphasized her heavy meth history, the possibility of substance-induced psychosis, and a difficult childhood and family situation. The prosecution countered with the interview footage itself, a woman answering coherently, recalling specific details, and, in the judge's own words when he reviewed the footage later, someone who understood what was happening throughout. After carefully weighing both faces, the jury rejected the insanity defense. They concluded that despite being heavily under the influence of drugs, Taylor Schabusiness hadn't lost the capacity to tell right from wrong at the time of the offense, a conclusion that would shape everything that came after. Over the course of a 3-day trial, one detail left many people watching, both in the courtroom and on screens, especially cold. Taylor was observed smiling, even smirking, while the court heard the most detailed and painful forensic testimony about Shad's death. She never took the stand. She never offered the jury her own explanation. That silence, paired with her expression during the trial's most painful moments, became one of the most haunting images the media carried away from the entire case. For the Therian family, sitting through that testimony was its own kind of ordeal. Hearing in clinical detail exactly what had been done to their son, while the person responsible for it sat a few feet away, showing no visible sign of what it was costing them to hear it. September 26, 2023, Brown County Court, Wisconsin. Taylor Schabusiness, then 25, walked into the courtroom wearing a spit hood, a security measure put in place after she'd spat on people while in custody awaiting trial. Not the movie image of a monster, just a young woman standing behind a thin mesh in a room full of people waiting to hear her fate decided. 19 months had passed since that morning her name first entered the public record. 19 months of pre-trial hearings, competency evaluations, and a case that had at various points made national news. Cameras from local stations lined the back of the room. Reporters who'd covered the trial for months sat with notebooks open, waiting for the two things a sentencing hearing is supposed to deliver: a number and a reason. In the room, the Therian family sat in the rows reserved for the victims' relatives. People who'd waited 19 months since that fateful morning to hear Justice's final answer. Judge Thomas Walsh asked Taylor if she had anything to say before he handed down the sentence. A pause. Her answer was only 2 words. No, there isn't. No apology, no explanation, nothing directed towards the family sitting just a few feet away, waiting for something, anything that might offer a shred of understanding. For many people in that room, that silence weighed heavier than any testimony given during the entire trial. Right before announcing the sentence, Judge Walsh told her a line that would later be widely quoted across the news. "You are not responsible for where you come from, but you have to be responsible for where you're going." And then he handed down the sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole or extended supervision for first-degree intentional homicide. On top of that, 2 consecutive sentences totaling 18 years for mutilating a corpse and sexual assault. A sentence built to guarantee one thing: whatever might change in the legal system down the line, Taylor Schabusiness would never walk out of prison alive. Taylor's defense attorney, Christopher Froelich, argued that his client was not a monster, and that at 25, there was still time for rehabilitation. It's the argument every defense attorney has to make in cases like this. Not because it's easy to make, but because someone has to make it. The system depends on it, even when it's the hardest sell in the room. Taylor's grandmother testified as a character witness. She and her husband were raising and in the process of legally adopting Taylor's 2-year-old son. Picture that child, growing up with his grandparents' care, carrying the last name of a mother he'll only ever know through news articles. A quiet cycle of intergenerational trauma was already taking shape in that courtroom that day, even if no one in the room said its name out loud. But prosecutors representing the Therian family made one thing clearer than anything else. The victim's family wanted Taylor locked away for life. Prosecutors fully agreed, pointing to what they described as a total absence of remorse from the defendant throughout the case, even as the court heard the most painful testimony from the victim's own family. For them, Taylor's words, "No, there isn't," weren't evidence of an empty mind. They were the final proof that justice, even when carried out, would never come with a real explanation attached. It's worth remembering that families in these cases don't really get to grieve privately. A case this widely covered means the worst day of your life becomes a headline other people scroll past. That's not something a sentence, however severe, can undo. The case formally closed legally that day, though an appeal process began the following year, and by late 2025, Taylor received an additional sentence for attacking a corrections officer at the facility where she's serving time. That detail matters, even though it's a footnote to the main case. It's a reminder that sentencing isn't always where a story quietly ends. For some people, incarceration doesn't change the underlying pattern, it just changes the setting. The person behind it all was finally dragged into the light of justice. But for the Therian family, the sentence, as severe as Wisconsin law allows, could never give back what they lost forever. Don't remember the perpetrator's name. Remember Shad Therian. Remember the young man, his father, when asked, described with exactly one word: polite. It would be easy, at the end of a video like this, to let the last image in your head be the one from the basement or the courtroom. We're asking you not to. Hold on to the other one instead. At the start of this video, we told you about a small habit of Shad's, that he never truly let go of people who'd once been close, that he was the kind of person who stayed in touch with old high school friends, years after their paths had gone their separate ways. That very thing, his loyalty to old relationships, his belief that someone he'd once known was still that same person, was, in the end, what opened the door to the right person on the wrong night. That wasn't a flaw in Shad. It was the best part of who he was, misplaced at the wrong moment with someone who had changed more than he could ever see with his own eyes. The real question isn't, how did this happen? It's right now, how many other people are sitting in a room with an old friend, with absolutely no idea that drugs, untreated mental illness, or some quiet shift has turned someone familiar into a real danger. Shad Therian is gone, but his story, and the way it's told honestly, without sensationalizing it, without smoothing over the real complexity between mental illness and criminal responsibility, is still helping people understand that fragile line between addiction, psychosis, and deliberate harm. That line matters beyond this one case. Every year, courts across the country wrestle with defendants whose actions were shaped, at least in part, by substances or untreated illness. Get the line wrong in one direction, and dangerous people walk free. Get it wrong in the other, and the justice system stops accounting for how broken a mind can genuinely become. There's no comfortable answer here. Only the responsibility to keep asking the question honestly, case by case. The image that lingers isn't the basement or the spit hood in the courtroom. It's a father standing before the court, using exactly one word to describe his son: polite. That's what Shad leaves behind. Not fear, but a simple memory of a decent person, someone who deserves to be remembered for more than how he died. Right now, as you're hearing these final lines, there's a real possibility that another old friendship, another relationship that feels completely safe, is quietly carrying a change that no one has noticed yet. Maybe it's not drugs. Maybe it's something else entirely. A mental health crisis nobody's named yet. A slow erosion nobody's tracking. The shape of the danger changes. The blind spot doesn't. The Taylor Schabusiness case closed in the Brown County court record in September 2023. But for anyone who studied the line between addiction, mental illness, and criminal responsibility, It remains one of the most cited cases when discussing the hardest question in the entire criminal justice system. How do you stay fair to the victim without oversimplifying what was actually happening inside a badly damaged mind? What do you think about this line between mental illness and criminal responsibility in this case? Leave a comment below, and if this story deserves to be remembered, hit like and subscribe to the Aaron Mejia channel so you don't miss the next case we cover with the care it deserves.